When truth is too loud to silence, even the cameras start to listen. There was once a time when a speech like this would never have been heard, not because it wasn't said, but because someone always made sure it was never broadcast. In the old world, microphones had off switches. Cameras had commercial breaks. Truth had editors. And men like him, they were either muted, mistranslated, or buried in footnotes. But this was a different day. He stood at the podium, not just as a man in military dress, but as a living contradiction, calm, but burning, young, but ancient in spirit. No notes, no teleprompter, just his eyes dark, unwavering, full of storms and a voice sharp enough to carve into history. The audience wasn't what you'd expect. No packed rows of mainstream journalists, no polite applause. What filled that hall wasn't press badges or international suits. It was ghosts. 500 years worth of forgotten names, of betrayed dreams, of nations drawn in ink and blood, of languages erased and mothers silenced. And now, someone had finally brought the ghosts a microphone. He cleared his throat, not nervously but purposefully. The world leaned in. Even the satellites paused. CNN, BBC, France 24. He began not accusing, not shouting, just declaring, "I'm watching you." The words didn't land like an insult. They landed like a verdict. I've seen how you frame us, how you cut the tape, twist the headlines, shrink our stories to sound bites, how you make our children look like criminals, our elders like fools, and our future like a footnote. No one moved. I know how the game is played, because for too long we've been the board you played it on. His hands didn't wave. He didn't pace. He stood still like stone and let the weight of every stolen narrative settle into the silence. Then he dropped the next line. I am recording every lie, archiving every distortion. And today, I am pulling off your masks. At that moment, something strange happened. Not in the room, but in the airwaves. The feeds didn't cut. The lights didn't dim. No producers screamed into earpieces, because even the technicians knew this was not a speech. It was a reckoning. The camera panned slowly. The sweat on a European correspondent's brow was more telling than any reaction, because they weren't prepared. No one was. This was not a leader lashing out. This was a generation stepping forward, and he spoke not as a politician, but as a witness. For centuries, you told our stories for us. You sent in your journalists after your soldiers, and you called that journalism. You filmed our children with empty bowls, but never the men who emptied our granaries. You captured our conflict zones, but never the boardrooms where those wars were planned. His voice was still calm, but now it carried an edge. The kind of edge that makes silence heavy. But that time is over. The camera doesn't blink anymore, and neither do we. Outside the hall, the world was igniting. Clips of his opening lines flooded every platform: TikTok, Instagram, X, YouTube. The caption that went viral: he said what no one dared to say, on camera. In Nairobi, a university professor paused her lecture and played the live stream. In Jamaica, a reggae DJ cut the music and played his speech through bass speakers. In Chicago, a young black girl whispered to her brother, "Why does he sound like Grandpa?" Because truth, when told without fear, always sounds familiar. It echoes. Back inside the hall, no one applauded. Not because they disagreed, but because they didn't know if they were allowed to. And that, he noted quietly to himself, was the problem. Your silence isn't neutrality, he said. It's complicity. You claim to be reporters, but you've been gatekeepers. And now, the gate is gone. The camera, once an agent of distortion, had become a witness. And the world? It was no longer watching him. It was finally listening. You are not born ashamed. Someone has to teach you how. He was 34. But his eyes didn't say 34. They said centuries. And not in some poetic sense, no, literally. He had the look of someone who had inherited the weight of 500 years, packed into the soft bones of a boy growing up in Ouagadougou. Not every scar bleeds. Some are learned through silence. He remembered the television, not as a window to the world, but as a mirror with cracks, each one showing a piece of Africa, but never the whole. The flickering images from the old television in the corner of the room haunted him. Skinny arms holding empty bowls, flies around the eyes of children, Rubble, dust, guns, always guns. Always children with guns. That's who they said we were, he whispered once, remembering. Savages, victims, beggars, war, disease, famine. Always the same movie, on repeat. And as a child, he believed it. Because shame, when repeated often enough, becomes a habit. His mother, a quiet woman with a backbone made of granite and grace, never spoke of politics. But when she watched those same shows, something hardened in her face. Not sadness, not rage. Just disappointment. As if someone had taken her home, her history, her dignity, and clipped it down to a headline. He didn't understand then, but he remembered. The real revolution, for him, didn't come with a rifle. It came with a book. He found it in a second-hand stall by the roadside. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked, the cover faded. The title, The Upright Man, a biography of Thomas Sankara. He didn't know who Sankara was, not yet. But by the third page, he was crying, not because of tragedy, but because for the first time in his life, he saw an African who didn't bow, a leader who refused luxury, who rode bicycles, who planted trees, who spoke in metaphors, but governed with fire, who said, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness." And just like that, the old movie began to crack. Wait, he thought. They told us we had no heroes, no thinkers, no revolutionaries, but they lied. He dug deeper, into history, into literature. He found names no textbook had taught him. Amilcar Cabral, Steve Biko, Funmilayo, Ransom Kuti, Mirio de Andrade. Voices that didn't come through the satellite dish, but through whispers, pamphlets, songs, prayers. He remembered the night he confronted his schoolteacher. "Why aren't these names in our syllabus?" he asked. The teacher looked at him sadly. "Because they scare the people who write the syllabus." From then on, he began rewriting his own story. He stopped watching the old broadcasts, started interviewing elders instead, men who remembered the time before borders, women who held stories in their eyes like libraries. Africa is not a victim, they told him. Africa was interrupted. That line changed him. He wasn't angry anymore. He was awake. Because once you realize that the shame you carried was planted, you begin to dig it out, root by root, lie by lie, until only truth remains. Years later, he would tell young cadets, "They didn't conquer Africa with guns. They conquered us with cameras, with textbooks, with pity. They made us ashamed of our past, so we'd surrender our future." He would point at maps with countries sliced by rulers, not rivers, at economic charts showing export wealth alongside child mortality. He would whisper in quiet tones during training, "Your enemy isn't always a soldier. Sometimes it's a story." Back in Ouagadougou, he walked past the same stalls now selling smartphones instead of Sankara books. But something had changed in him. The shame had been burned out. In its place, fire. And in his throat, a voice that could no longer be silenced. Because when you've been lied to your entire life, telling the truth doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like breathing. If a tree grows in a forest and no one reports it, did it ever bloom? The room was still. The kind of silence that doesn't come from absence but from anticipation. He looked across the cameras. Not just physical ones, but the invisible ones too. The ones behind algorithms, behind editorial desks, behind everything they thought we'd never see. "Let me ask you something," he said, pacing slowly. "When was the last time you turned on your television and saw Africa without tragedy?" Pause. Did you see the engineers in Kigali designing drones for agriculture? Did you see Ghanaian scientists developing rapid malaria diagnostics? Did you see the Maasai women running solar farms in Kenya? The air felt electric. Even the journalists, those still brave enough to attend, had stopped typing. Some looked down, others straight at him, stunned. He continued, "Number. Because that's not the Africa that sells. You don't sell news about stability, you sell fires. You sell famine, you sell fear. The Africa they showed was always hungry, always corrupt, always waiting for help. But the Africa he knew? It danced, it innovated, it survived hurricanes of exploitation, and still sang with a voice the world refused to hear. "How do you control a people?" he asked, quieter now. "You erase their joy." And so they did. Behind every breaking news alert about coups, there were years of elections they never covered. Behind every photo of a refugee camp, there were cities being built, technologies launched, entrepreneurs thriving. But none of that fit the script. "Your Africa must remain desperate," he said. "Because if we're not broken, then you don't get to be the savior." He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. He turned to the board. A giant LED screen lit up behind him. One by one, he showed them. Rwanda, a nation that once bled, now digitizing government faster than most of Europe. Ethiopia, building the Grand Renaissance Dam, the largest hydro project in Africa without foreign loans. Botswana, over 5 decades of stable democracy, free education, public health care. Kenya, home to M-Pesa, a mobile banking system studied in Harvard but born in Nairobi's informal markets. "You didn't show this on your front pages," he said, "because it doesn't fit your old, dusty narrative." A map appeared. Green dots glowed across the continent. Data hubs, wind farms, space agencies, clean tech labs, real places, real people, real progress. Not miracles efforts, not fantasy fact. "For too long," he said, "we've been told that our value lies in our suffering." He paused. "Let that sink in. The world doesn't see our brilliance because it never turned its camera toward our light." And then came the question that shifted the tone. What would happen if the world truly saw us? Not as victims, not as rebels, not as headlines, but as equals? There was a moment of stillness. Then something remarkable happened. A young woman, clearly a junior producer in the back row, began to cry. Quietly, quickly. As if the weight of the lie she helped broadcast had finally landed. Online, the video was already spreading. Within hours, captions in Swahili, Yoruba, Zulu, Amharic, and French began appearing. Hashtags like Africa Unedited and Tell the Whole Story trended not just in Africa, but in Berlin, Toronto, Sao Paulo, and Seoul. Artists made murals. Teachers used clips in classrooms. In Lagos, a group of high schoolers remixed the speech into a spoken-word anthem titled, "We Were Never Silent." It wasn't a viral moment. It was a mirror held up to the world. And people weren't just watching. They were questioning. As he looked into the lens again, his voice steady, he left them with one final statement. Africa has nothing to prove. We built pyramids when others were still drawing maps. What we need now is not validation. We need accuracy. We need truth. He smiled faintly, but without humor. And if you can't show the whole story, we'll tell it ourselves. Then he walked off stage. No music, no flashbulbs. Just the sound of a continent quietly standing taller. You cannot starve a people standing on bread. His voice was steady, but his eyes, those eyes burned with a pain older than his own life. "We don't lack wealth," he said. "We lack permission to enjoy it." He stepped to the screen, which lit up with maps colored in reds, golds, blues. They weren't political borders. They were resource veins, Africa's veins, running like ancient lifelines beneath every inch of its soil. Gold, diamonds, cobalt, uranium, lithium, rare earths, oil. "This," he said, pointing, "is not a curse. It's not a burden. It's not the reason we suffer. The reason is that someone else keeps the key to the vault we sleep on." He walked slowly across the stage. Behind him, the screen shifted to satellite images. A lush green Congo rainforest, a sparkling diamond mine in Botswana, an oil rig off the Nigerian coast. Africa feeds your machines, your jets, your phones, your clean energy dreams, he said. Yet children in the same villages that mine these riches are drinking from rivers shared with animals. The screen changed again. A girl barefoot, carrying a yellow container. A young boy covered in dust hacking at rock with his hands in a cobalt field. "These are not illustrations," he said. "They are daily truths, and the world calls us poor while wearing our wealth on their wrists." The silence deepened. You could almost hear breath being held. Now, came the numbers. Not guesses, not metaphors. Hard, economic data, unforgiving, and unemotional. $256 billion, he said. That's what the top 10 mining firms make annually in Africa. A pause. $500 million. That's the tax they pay us in total. That's 0.2%. Not 2%. Not even 1. He turned to the crowd, no longer just speaking, but accusing with facts. You tax your citizens more to fund your schools than you pay the people whose land gives you the resources for your iPads. The slide changed again, this time to corporate logos. Glencore, Rio Tinto, Anglo-American, Total Energies. He didn't say they were evil. He didn't need to. The math was the weapon. This is not theft with guns, he said. This is theft with contracts. The screen now displayed a timeline of concessions. 99-year mining rights, in exchange for infrastructure projects never finished. 0% royalty deals in exchange for political favors. Exploration licenses granted in backroom hotel meetings. Colonialism didn't end, he said, voice firm. It just changed clothes. From uniforms to briefcases. From gunboats to shareholder meetings. People watching online began posting the phrase, colonialism by calculator. It spread like wildfire. He named names not to shame, but to wake. Niger, uranium-rich, yet dependent on diesel generators. Ghana, gold-producing for centuries, yet imports tomatoes. Mali, lithium exporter, yet lacking basic power. Congo, cobalt capital of the world, yet lacking paved roads in mining towns. You cannot tell me this is by accident. You cannot convince me this is the price of development. The images on the screen were raw, real faces, real places. Mothers sitting outside hospitals with no electricity. Miners living in tin roof shacks beside billion-dollar quarries. How can a continent that feeds the industrial engine of the world be hungry? He asked. Then he answered himself. Because hunger is control. If you're starving, you don't rebel. If you're desperate, you don't negotiate. Then came the most shocking reversal of all. They say we are receiving aid, he said. Let me tell you the truth. The screen lit up with flowcharts. Each arrow showed billions leaving Africa each year through tax evasion, capital flight, unfair trade. Every year, $88 billion leaves this continent illegally. Yet we receive $45 billion in so-called aid. He raised his voice, not shouting, but sharpening. That's not charity. That's a refund. And even then, we don't get half of what we're owed. A new phrase lit up on screen. Africa is not receiving aid. Africa is giving it. He paused. Not to think, but to let the truth settle like dust after an explosion. If we owned just 10% more of our mineral wealth, he said, we could provide free education for every African child. Every hospital would have lights. Every family could sleep under a roof that doesn't leak. He looked straight into the lens. But we are told to be grateful, to wait, to beg. Then came his final line. Not a scream, not a chant, just a whisper with the weight of a thunderstorm. No more. That evening, radio stations across Ghana replayed the speech. In Kisangani, workers walked out of a foreign-run gold mine, demanding contracts be renegotiated. In Cape Town, students wrote essays on resource sovereignty. In Abuja, even some ministers debated quietly about revisiting old mining laws. It wasn't revolution, not yet, but it was realignment. A slow, burning fire under the feet of those who had long stood on gold and been told to be grateful for crumbs. The camera panned away from his face, but this time, the microphone stayed on. And Africa listened. It's hard to fight a ghost, but harder to live, haunted. He stood in the soft light of a hall filled with diplomats, journalists, and scholars. No stage this time, no podium, just a circle, a conversation, a war of ideas. And he began not with blame, but with a story. When I was a child, he said softly, I used to wonder why Africa was always on the receiving end, always being taught, always being helped, always being rescued. The room listened. We were told we didn't manage well, that corruption was our disease, that we had no systems. He paused. But what if that's not the full story? What if the system is working just not for us? That line landed heavy. There is a system, he said. You just don't see it. Because it doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't raise a flag. It doesn't need to. He called it the system with no name. He drew a circle on a whiteboard. A mining company enters a deal. A local elite signs it trained in Western business schools. Profits leave the country channeled through offshore accounts. Loans come back in the form of debt issued with conditions. To qualify for those loans, cut health care, privatize water, deregulate land, and the cycle repeats. We are told to be fiscally responsible, he said. But what about those who made billions and paid nothing? He didn't call out names. He didn't have to. The room knew. In our schools, he said, we learn Shakespeare before we read Ning, Ji, Wathiongo. We quote Socrates before we learn about Ibn Khaldun. We measure progress in English, in French, before we speak our own truths. He paused again. What happens to a generation that can code in Python but doesn't know how their land was stolen? What happens when the minds are sharpened but cut off from roots? He didn't call this cultural colonization. He called it the deletion. And again the silence grew loud. He described elections without power, markets without access, television with 1,000 channels and none that showed reality. They say, we are free. But what is freedom if the menu has many dishes but one owner? He looked at the younger attendees. You are told to hustle, to innovate, to dream, but your dreams are hosted on someone else's server. Your businesses depend on someone else's supply chain. Your value is judged in someone else's currency. Then came the line they would quote for days. You are allowed to run as long as you stay in their race. The new power, he said, does not scream. It signs agreements. It builds training centers. It gives scholarships with fine print. It gives loans with leash strings. And the room understood. This was not oppression by force, but by design. The modern empire doesn't take. It invites you to give graciously, continuously, unknowingly. The screen now showed two contrasting images. One, a minister in a suit shaking hands with a foreign donor. Two, a child walking 6 kilometers for clean water. Aid is often given with headlines, but taken back quietly through backdoor terms. He told of a village gifted a solar panel farm, except the equipment couldn't be serviced locally, except the parts had to be imported from the very same donor nation, except the maintenance contract was owned by a foreign firm for 20 years. It's not help if it creates dependence. It's not generosity if it comes with a bill. He summarized the symptoms. A continent that feeds the world but eats last. Nations rich in lithium and oil but exporting raw tomatoes and importing ketchup. Leaders elected with pride but operating within invisible margins. We are told to rise, he said, but only within the lines drawn for us. And then came his challenge. You cannot reform what you do not name, and you cannot resist what you do not see. He didn't offer a perfect solution, but he offered questions. What if we measured development in sovereignty, not GDP? What if local engineers built the roads and owned the tools? What if trade meant equals, not winners and dependents? He spoke of education that teaches who we are, not just how to perform. He spoke of agriculture that feeds locals first, of digital networks hosted in Africa, of currencies backed by African value. We can't fight a ghost, but we can build a mirror. We can stop asking for a seat at their table and build our own. No applause, just quiet awe. Then, one by one, young people stood up not to clap, but to write down the name of the chapter in their notebooks. The system with no name. It would become a slogan, a podcast, a curriculum unit, and, someday, a documentary. But for now, it was a seed, planted quietly in the minds of those who had always felt the system, but finally saw it for what it was. You can't speak truth to power if the microphone belongs to power. The room was cold, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the silence that followed Chapter 5. He hadn't left the stage, but something had shifted. His voice no longer carried the heat of rage, but the precision of a scalpel. We've spoken of the system, he began. Now let's talk about its watchdogs. The crowd leaned forward. They already knew where this was going, but they didn't expect how far it would go. I respect journalism, he he said. But what happens when the press becomes a filter, not a mirror? He paused. You say you cover Africa, but where were you when Niger's youth built their own solar power grid? When Ghana's students developed AI tools for local medicine? When Burkina Faso created its own postal bank? Silence. You only arrived when there were flames, when there were coups, when there was blood. Because peace is boring to you. Dignity doesn't get views. He turned to a chart on the screen behind him. The New York Times majority owned by one of the richest men in Mexico. The Washington Post owned by Jeff Bezos. Fox News. A Rupert Murdoch empire. These are not newspapers. These are empires. And you trust them to report on justice? He pointed toward the crowd. Who owns your microphone determines what you're allowed to say. And if the richest man on earth controls your platform, who do you think his editor will protect? No one answered. Then came the part no journalist expected. Your Africa coverage is written in Paris accents, New York slang, Oxford grammar. But who among you speaks Zulu, Swahili, Hausa, Amharic? He looked directly at the media pool. You land for 3 days, interview a taxi driver, and publish a think piece about our future. You stand in our villages for 4 hours and tell the world we are broken. But how long did you study our languages? How many of your editors are from here? They fidgeted. But he wasn't done. You translate our suffering into your scripts. You subtitle our pain for your audience. But you never ask, what if the narrative was never yours to write? He began showing headlines on the screen. West African strongman defies democracy crisis. Deepens in the Sahel, Russia's influence grows as West retreats. Then he added the dates. None of these articles were written before local sovereignty movements. They only came after economic independence had been declared. When we were silent, you called us peaceful. When we stood up, you called us dangerous. He looked out over the sea of faces. You don't fear chaos. You fear a different order. You say we report facts, he said. But which facts do you ignore? He listed them off. Foreign troops on African soil with diplomatic immunity, billions in mining profits untaxed. Local protests censored in your headlines. What you call journalism is sometimes just PR with better fonts. But then, his voice softened. This isn't personal, he said. Many of you are good people in a broken structure. You're taught objectivity. But objectivity without context becomes complicity. He offered a challenge. Stop being megaphones. Start being mirrors. He pointed to the journalists in the back. Ask who funds your trips. Ask who sets your assignments. Ask who cuts your paychecks. And then ask yourself, what stories haven't you told? By now, the live stream had exploded. Hashtags trended worldwide. Media mask off. Who owns the mic? African voices matter. And from Nairobi to New York, young journalists whispered the words that Traoré had lit like fire. We don't need more correspondents. We need co-authors of truth. As the session ended, a journalist from Brazil asked a final question. So what do we do now? He smiled gently. For the first time that day. You look again. You listen longer. You tell the story that's been waiting to be told not for your audience, but for the truth. And with that, he walked off the stage. Not as a president, but as the man who had just pulled the lens back far enough for the world to see itself. You killed the body, but not the dream. The room dimmed again. He returned to the center of the stage not to accuse, but to remember. This time, his words felt like incense burning in a cathedral. Reverent, slow, devastating. You buried them, he said, but the soil never forgot. And then he began calling the names. He gave us a voice, and they answered with a gun. The photo appeared on the screen. A young man in glasses, eyes sharp with courage. The first prime minister of the Congo. You say, the Cold War swallowed him. Number. He was served on a silver platter by collaborators and melted in acid by his enemies. A pause. 61 years later, Belgium returned a tooth. One tooth. As if a single molar could wash away colonial murder. The audience stirred. You see, the West fears black brilliance more than black violence. Lumumba didn't take arms. He took the mic. And then, the screen changed. A black and white photo. A lean, intense figure in military uniform, holding no weapon, only a vision. He gave our children vaccines. He gave our women voices. He gave our farmers dignity. He paused again, his voice lowered. and he gave us a warning. Beware the man who comes bearing loans. The hall held its breath. He rejected the IMF, banned female genital mutilation, turned state vehicles into bicycles. And for this, they silenced him. His voice cracked not from weakness, but from awe. They said he was too radical. But what's radical about planting 10 million trees? The audience, digital and physical, was utterly still. Burkina Faso buried him in secrecy. But we walk in his shadow, proudly, every day. A third phase. This time, grainy footage of Gaddafi at the African Union, holding up a map of a united Africa. You hated him not because he oppressed. You hated him because he dreamed. He was careful here, measured, surgical. Gaddafi built free housing, free electricity, free education, and a dam across the Sahara. But his crime? Proposing a gold-backed African currency. You didn't invade Libya for oil alone. You invaded to stop an idea. The crowd didn't cheer. They grieved. And while his body was beaten on camera, one woman laughed. We came. We saw. He died. He looked up at the ceiling. History will remember that laughter and judge it. He stepped closer to the audience now. No longer just a speaker, he had become a voice of memory. Every time a child dies from preventable hunger, Lumumba dies again. Every time a loan breaks a nation's spine, Sankara bleeds again. Every time an idea is assassinated by bombs, Gaddafi screams again. He looked down. You didn't bury martyrs. You planted seeds. And then, the room darkened. One last name appeared. A question appeared on screen. Who's next? Then came a line of fire. You've killed enough. Now the world is watching. He turned back to the audience. The next Sankara might not wear a uniform. The next Lumumba may speak from a classroom. The next Gaddafi may come with code instead of oil. And this time, you won't silence them. He stood alone for a full 10 seconds. The silence wasn't empty. It was loud with ghosts. Loud with memory. Loud with a quiet, rising defiance. You wanted us to forget, but we remember, not out of vengeance, but so we don't repeat this dance. Not to hate, but to heal. Then he stepped down, and the lights came up, but something had shifted forever. You drew borders, we drew bridges. The hot Sahel wind swept across Ouagadougou's main square like an invisible drumbeat. Beneath the fiery sunset, thousands stood in silence. No one chanted slogans. No one gave orders. But everyone understood they were living the first lines of a new chapter. From a balcony draped in the flag of the Sahel, Traoré stepped forward. No microphone, no bodyguards. He looked down at the sea of people and began. We were told to wait, he said. Wait for loans. Wait for reforms. Wait for someone else to fix what was broken. But the wait is over. The first applause came from a mother holding her child. Then it rippled outward like wind through dry grass, across thousands of beating hearts. A new alliance is born. Inside the presidential office, advisors still looked tense. That day, 3 nations, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, had signed an unprecedented pact, the Sahel Alliance Treaty. Not just military cooperation, but a vow: we will rise together or we will fall alone. A map appeared on national television, not colonial borders, but a red belt stretching from Timbuktu to Fata Ngorma. An alliance, a freedom corridor, breaking the chains, not with guns, but with grain. At a global press conference, Traoré didn't speak of war. He spoke of rice. We import rice from Thailand while our rivers go dry. We buy tomatoes from Spain while our farmers burn their crops. This is not poverty. This is sabotage. A new initiative was launched, Feed the Sahel, a regional agricultural network. Burkina Faso, responsible for high-yield rice strains. Niger, supplying solar energy for irrigation. Mali, managing shared food storage facilities. We will not eat what we do not grow, he said, and we will not grow under anyone's permission. The phone that never rang. After the speech, in a brief moment of stillness, Traoré turned to look at the red phone on his presidential desk, the line reserved for emergency calls from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. This time, it didn't ring. Not because they didn't care, but because they were confused. The French Foreign Ministry called an emergency meeting. The U.S. temporarily froze humanitarian aid. But the more they sanctioned, the more united the Sahel people became. The youth answer back on TikTok. The hashtag Sahel Uprising crossed 100 million views in just 3 days. A homegrown Burkinab rap song titled No CFA, No Chains went viral across Africa. In universities from Cotonou to Accra, students wore T-shirts with Traoré's face and the words, "Not a president, a generation." The quiet revolution back in Ouagadougou, night had fallen, but the square remained lit not by fireworks, but by eyes full of fire. Traoré stepped down from the balcony, not as a speaker, but as a father, a friend, a fellow citizen. A 10-year-old boy ran up and tugged at his sleeve. "Uncle Traoré, will we have our own school now?" Not in French, but in Moor. Traoré knelt down, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Yes, you'll learn in your language, and you'll teach others in your truth. The Sahel doesn't rise, it awakens." Before leaving the square, Traoré paused and looked up at the blood-red sky. "They will call us rebellious, but we are only remembering who we were before the world forgot." An elder in the crowd cried out in Bambara, "Sahel Kaf! The Sahel has spoken!" The desert was changing. Not just the wind, not just the sand, but the air itself. It no longer carried the scent of fear. It carried fire. Not from war, but from awakening. Weeks had passed since Traoré's speech in Riyadh, but its echo hadn't faded. It had multiplied. Across Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, his words became not just remembered, but repeated. Not just repeated, but lived. In village gatherings, university halls, crowded markets, and even in dusty courtyards lit only by candlelight, one phrase was whispered, then shouted, "The age of begging is over." In Western capitals, the backlash was swift. The World Bank quietly froze lending. France pulled advisors and stirred its media machine into action. Editorials in Paris labeled him a charismatic populist with dangerous ideas. In Washington, think tanks rang alarm bells. Even the African Union, usually silent, issued a statement of deep concern. But Traoré didn't blink. Back in Ouagadougou, he convened his core advisors not for war in the traditional sense, but for a different kind of battle, the war for economic dignity. France will use every lever they still hold. UEMOA, the CFA franc, the banks, said Finance Minister Issa Zaber, leaning forward with tension in his voice. They'll starve us, slowly sanctions, trade restrictions, reputational smears. Traoré was quiet. He looked at the map on the wall. The Sahel. Lines drawn long ago by people who never lived there. Lines he no longer recognized. Then he said simply, "Then we'll break the levers." Colonel Diarra, the new head of intelligence, and a lifelong Pan-African leaned in. "We've been speaking to Mali and Niger," he said. "They're ready to move, to ditch the CFA franc, to create something that's ours." "A regional currency?" Traoré asked. "A regional future," Diarra replied. "We already trade with each other. Now we can value each other." "What about uranium?" Traoré asked. "Will Niger hold?" Diarra smiled. "They've nationalized the fields. France is furious, but Tiani's holding strong." For the first time that night, Traoré allowed himself to smile. "Let them fume," he said. "Let them know what losing control feels like." That evening, his cybersecurity team intercepted a diplomatic cable. Codename, Operation Stabilize, Sahel, Brussels, Washington, Paris. A quiet coalition forming. Quiet, but deadly. The plan? Collapse the Sahelian economies, crack open internal divisions, and if needed, install a more stable leader. But Traoré had already moved first. At sunrise, a declaration went live broadcast across the region via Radio Sahel Libre, the new media voice of the alliance. "We, the nations of the Sahel, declare economic sovereignty not as protest, but as policy. We will form a central bank of the Sahel. Our currency will not be printed in Paris. Our future will not be negotiated in English or French, but in Mossi, Zarma, Bambara, and Fulfulde. Those who trade with us must do so with respect or not at all." The statement went viral. In Dakar, crowds spilled into the streets chanting, not rioting. In Accra, students held up signs. If the Sahel can break free, so can we. The hashtag Sahel Rising exploded. It reached black communities in London, Sao Paulo, Atlanta, Cape Town. It wasn't just a movement. It was a mirror held up to the world. And in Washington, the mood shifted. Behind closed doors, at AFRICOM, General Wallace gritted his teeth. "This kid," he said, "is becoming the Sankara we couldn't stop the first time." Silence. Then a new directive. Contain him. Discredit him. Quietly. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood on the people's balcony, facing a sea of people. Children on shoulders. Women with tears in their eyes. Men holding flags not of countries but of unity. He didn't shout. He didn't speak to the world. He spoke to the people. They will call us dangerous. They will say we are dividing Africa. But I say this. What we are dividing is the lie. The lie that says we are weak. The lie that says we cannot rise without permission. The lie that says we were born to be managed, not to lead. He raised his hand, not in anger, but in promise. We are not asking for a seat at their table. We are building our own. And this time, the invitation is ours to give. The crowd roared. Flags waved like fire in the night. Above them, the Sahel sky burned red, not with flames, but with dawn. The night Ouagadougou glowed with firelight, not from war, not from violence, but from candles. Candles held by children, by mothers, by teachers, by market women and mechanics. They stood in silence, not in protest, in declaration. From 1,000 rooftops and city squares, they held up signs scribbled by hand. We remember, we rise, we are not what you filmed. And far above them, Ibrahim Traoré stood still. No microphone, no podium, no armor. Just a man under the stars, listening to the heartbeat of a continent. The world was watching. CNN cut in live this time not because they wanted to, but because ignoring him had become impossible. BBC didn't overlay his speech with narration. France 24 didn't add subtitles that twisted his tone. The truth had become uneditable. He stepped forward. "Tonight," he said slowly, "we are not here to speak. We are here to finish a sentence that began 500 years ago." The crowd below didn't erupt. They just stood there, listening, as if silence itself was a language they had rediscovered. He continued, "They called us tribes, but we were civilizations. They called us poor, but we were rich in soul, in soil, in spirit. They called us threats, but it was always projection." He paused. "And yet, despite the whips, the debts, the guns, and the lies, we're still here, still rising, still remembering." His voice cracked not from weakness, but from the weight of remembering too much. "They told you Africa was a place. I tell you now, Africa is a mirror. If you distort us, it is your own reflection that trembles." Then he did something no one expected. He stepped down from the stage and into the crowd. No cameras followed, just candlelight. He walked barefoot through the crowd, hugging grandmothers, greeting children, listening to a farmer's story about planting his first cotton harvest without foreign seeds. And finally, he stopped at a small girl, no older than 7. She held up a crayon drawing of the map of Africa. Except this time, the borders were gone. One continent, one name, one future. He knelt beside her and whispered loud enough for the world to hear, "They tried to erase us from history. But tonight, we are writing the future in our own handwriting." In Washington, the monitors flickered. In Paris, the advisors whispered. In London, the lights in conference rooms stayed on past midnight. But in the Sahel, people finally slept with their doors open. The fear had left the air. The dust now carried something heavier than fear. It carried possibility. The next morning, a journalist from Brazil wrote in her dispatch, "What Traoré said was powerful." But it was not his speech that shook the world. It was the silence that followed. The silence of people no longer asking for permission to dream. And so, the world did not change in a thunderclap. It changed in a whisper, in 1,000 languages, in candlelight. As the sun rose, the people chanted not slogans of war or vengeance, but of awakening. We are not the story you wrote. We are the voice you can no longer silence.